PNG. Welcome to the Caribou, and welcome back if you had a look at the Caribou video featuring some of the things that make the Caribou such a unique aircraft. We'll be traveling today from here, Asimba, up to Yongai Strip. We'll then continue the climb further up over the backbone of Papua New Guinea, reaching altitude of roughly 11,500 feet. We'll extend across the plateau down past Witapi. We'll run the strip at Fane. Off Fane, we'll head off to terminate in Tapini. Numbers-wise, it's about 44 nautical miles as the crow flies. However, as you'll see, we end up having to cover a lot more ground just trying to negotiate some of the terrain and some of the considerations involved. Anyway, let's get cracking.
Well, welcome to what would probably be Wallaby Airlines if you're operating the RWF Caribou up in PNG, because it was 35 Squadron with Wallaby Airlines that was usually up here. I spent most of my time with 38 Squadron Det A, which was Black Duck Airlines over in WA. But let's get this fired up. So battery master is on. We're going to talk at length about the start switches and how the start actually works versus what it does in the sim. We'll need boost pump switches on, and before we run the start as well, we want to have the position and anti-coal lights on. Now let's talk about the start situation then. You've got the three switches that are sitting here in front of us at the moment. The top switch is a start switch. We'll rotate that to the right conventionally. How you're going to do that is your left hand with your palm facing the right engine will operate using the three middle fingers of your left hand. The top switch, move to the right engine. That will turn the engine through the specific number of blades that you require. Standard is 15 blades, so every time a blade runs through, the flight engineer will count the blades. When you reach 15 for a cold start, then you're ready to go. The reason you're doing that is for two reasons. One, it pre-oils the engine, which is important in a radial. And two, you need to know that the engine isn't going to hydraulic. If one of the lower cylinders in the radial engine, as it is a radial engine, you have cylinders right down the bottom, it is possible for those cylinders with a leak inside the cylinder itself to fill full of oil. If it does that, and you notice that while you're cranking the motor just with the starter on its own, then you can stop, drain the oil, and get back into another start. That does happen from time to time. It's not very common, but it does happen. If you went straight into a combustion start, you actually had the engine firing up and it got to the point where the piston was trying to raise in one of those lower cylinders and there was hydraulicking involved because it was full of oil. The oil is not compressible. Remember, an engine is just a big air pump with a piston engine. And in trying to compress that oil, you'll do phenomenal amounts of damage to the engine. So that's why we're checking it. 15 blades when it's cold, 7 blades when it's hot. We're running through that start cycle. Once we get to the certain number of blades, we'll call ignition. The co-pilot will rotate the magneto switch to both, and he will call, or she will call, ignition. Say again, contact. So I call ignition, they call contact, and I switch on the lower two switches as well across to that right hand engine. So now all three fingers in the middle of my hand are operating to get the right engine to fire up. As soon as it does fire up, I release both of the top two switches and I hold in the prime switch. Now, what are those switches doing? The middle switch is a vibe switch. It puts DC power directly to the right magneto. Now, magnetos, the way they work, so long as the engine is actually turning, as it would be with a starter motor, then that magneto is developing the charge like an ignition coil, and it's also distributing the charge to the spark plugs. The left magneto to the front, right magneto to the rear plugs. So the prime switch, with the fuel pumps activated on the fuel panel, it opens up a solenoid valve like a fuel injector, and it injects a fine spray of atomized fuel into the intake of the supercharger. Once the engine actually fires, you release both the top two switches, and holding in the prime switch, you can keep the engine running at idle for as long as you want, just operating that prime switch. Once you reach that point and you're happy, then you ask the co-pilot auto rich. They'll say auto rich as they move the mixture lever all the way forward. you will take 1 to 2 seconds and you'll hear the engine hesitate from a rich cut, as in the engine's getting too much fuel to run properly, and at that point you release the switch. Now all 3 switches are back to their neutral position. That is a spring-centered position, and with any luck at all, you got it all right, and you didn't end up making some very loud noises, as in what people call backfires, actually afterfires, so unburnt fuel coming out through the exhaust, and what the flight engineers referred to as shooting ducks. Always embarrassing if you do that, and quite common if you're just learning how to start the engine for the first time. Now the tricky thing, and the reason why they call it playing the piccolo, basically, once you've started up that right engine, you now need to turn your left hand over with your palm of your left hand facing the left engine, and now your middle 3 fingers are operating again the top switch, the bottom 2 switches, and then holding on the bottom switch once the start has been successful. So it's a really interesting sequence. I haven't seen it on any other aircraft. It may exist, but I haven't seen it on anything else. And I'll just show you a very short insert for 3 centered switches and give you an idea of exactly how that works, so you'll see the sequence of it anyway. Most important thing, we are cranking the blades through without magnetos on initially, and then we call ignition, co-pilot calls contact, throw up the bottom 2 switches, the engine fires, release the top 2 switches. As soon as the engine fires, hold on the prime for as long as you wish until you call auto rich. Auto rich, you get a rich cut, the engine hesitates, release the bottom switch, and you're up and running. From that point, it's also important that we get up to 800 to 1000 RPM, so that if it idles too low, there's a much higher probability or a more rapid onset of fouling the spark plugs, which you don't want to do, especially when you're running out of a strip like this, because you'll end up losing power. Alrighty, so that's the start sequence. Really interesting, but not possible to model it at the moment, or to perform it at least in this model in the sim. So we have magnetos on and we have auto rich. Our throttles need to be forwards about a grip width of the throttle. That should be about right. The flight engineer will make sure everything's all clear on the outside, and we'll rotate to the right. First engine's up and running. All pressure's good, 800 to 1000 and holding. And do a switch cup check. Didn't hear anything there, but so be it. All clear on the left. Did hear a hesitation there. Get our generators online. Up and charging. So we'll warm the engine up between 800 and 1000, and after that will be 1000 to 1200 to try and reduce the fouling as much as possible. Below 800 RPM is where you get maximum fouling. We won't be going through a full engine run-up. The engine run-up is fairly conventional for what you would look at for any kind of piston engine. We'll go through and check things left to right. We'll check the stick shakers first, but the stick shakers aren't modeled in here. This is the switch for the stick shakers up on the top left, and on the back of the control columns here you can see the actual stick shakers themselves. So it's an eccentric weight on the back of an electric motor. The light stick shakers will come on 8 knots before the stall, and the heavy stick shakers will come on 4 knots before the stall. And they're quite effective. It's not unusual to come on the stick shakers even in the base term when you're flying STOL operations. Next thing will be to come along and check the auto feather system. The auto feather system will operate if one engine is providing 45% thrust more than the other, plus or minus 2.5% from memory. The prop reversing lights up here in all the aircraft I've flown are blue, and this aircraft they're orange. And you'll actually check those lights just by pushing them, making sure the bulbs come on. Really important, because if you don't have 2 blue lights when you go into a strip, meaning both props have gone into their prop reverse, and you pull the power in for prop reverse, there is a good chance that you're going to yaw the aircraft, lose control, and run off the strip. So really important that you have two blues. And you'll hear people say actually two blues, just to confirm that on the runway, which we can't do because we'll say two orange. Okay, manual feather is the buttons here, so you push them in, drop 1 to 200 RPM, pull them back out again, and into the props, your standard sort of prop run, 1900 RPM, that we'll set with the throttles, and then we'll pull the props back and make sure that we're getting the appropriate RPM on the bottom end. Mixtures auto lean, auto rich, we can check, and then you got your carb air as well as your magneto switches, which when we're at higher RPM we do check the left and right magnetos, just looking for the drop, but being super careful not to accidentally switch the magnetos off. If you do that, you'll get again what a lot of people will mistakenly refer to as a backfire. A backfire is actually up through the carburetor, afterfire is out through the exhaust. But if you end up developing an afterfire from the unburnt fuel shooting out through the exhaust, that's enough to end up possibly dislodging the exhaust studs, which are the studs that hold the exhaust onto the cylinder, and blowing the exhaust off the engine, so you can cause a lot of damage with that as well. Alright, so we're just going to make sure that our temperatures are up to speed. While we're talking about temperatures, oil temperatures down here on the ground, they seem to be okay. As soon as you get airborne and start doing anything with the engine and any kind of cruise or climb, it sits well above the red. It's sitting about 105 degrees, so maximum is 93. Nothing we can do about that. So when we look down for temperatures and pressures today, we're going to see that both of those oil temperature gauges are not working correctly. And while we're here as well, we should be cruising usually up to about 7,000 feet. We're setting 700 brake horsepower at any altitude for cruise. 700 brake horsepower up to about 7,000 feet is set using 1900 RPM. If you set anything below 2000 RPM or about 1950, we end up getting both of the low oil pressure lights coming on. Those oil pressure lights should only come on at 45 psi plus or minus 2, which you'd only usually see at a very low idle, like down around the 600, 700 RPM as an idle check. If you see them at any other time, then yeah, you've got a problem. Alrighty, we will sort out our before takeoffs and start taxiing out. I'll make sure we've got our taxi, our landing lights are on, auto feather system is set. Our flap, we'll set 25 flap for a short field. Okay, conventional flap setting would be below 24,000 pounds, be looking at around 15 flap, and then as you get heavier, you reduce the flap setting to 7 and 0 flap if you have enough room to do that. We can take off short field using 20 or 25 flap, but 25 flap is more standard, and we'll get out and get on our way. All clear left. I'm going to take the gust lock out. That's what this is. It operates like an old school automatic with a T-handle. Release that. When that gust lock is in and you move the controls, it literally locks all the controls in place, which allows you to taxi without having to guard the flight controls. And you can't take off with the gust lock in because you have to release it, which ended up resulting in a very nasty accident when they experimented early 90s putting turboprop engines in to re-engine the Caribou, the PNG conversion. When they put the turboprop engines in, they put the throttles down the bottom, down here where the radio boat is, but they left the gust lock up the top, and unfortunately in front of a crowd of people, including the family of the pilots that were on board on that day, 3 people on board, the aircraft took off with the gust lock in, pitched up nose high, and does what most aircraft do when they take off with the gust lock in. It pitches very high, rolls to the right, and hits the ground at nearly 90 degrees, so everyone was lost on that flight. That's the significance of the gust lock. So we are in auto rich. Props are forward, auto feather is set, our trims are set for takeoff. We're using maximum length of the airfield as much as is reasonable. That's always a good idea for a couple of reasons. One, short field, that's what we teach. Not going up the slope at the other end, because you want to make the most of all of the room that you have, obviously. But also, if you end up having to abort and you end up one aircraft length off the end of the runway and you started short, then that's going to be embarrassing too. Okay, for our takeoff out of here, we look at an emergency brief. So if we have any fire, failure, loss of directional control up to the point that we're airborne and clear of the trees, we're basically not going to make it. The Caribou doesn't have any power to get off the ground if you lose an engine. If that happens, we'll call the abort. I'll select idle and reverse, and then brakes as required, and we will pick a location right in the middle, I suspect, to go off the end, ideally sharing the wings off between two trees to reduce the impact damage. And I am not kidding, that's exactly what your brief is for this aircraft. On the rotate for short field, when we come off the ground, it'll be about 60 knots. We'll hold the 60 knots till we're clear of the trees, then lower the nose for a right turn out. The low ground is out to the right, high ground to the left. So we'll turn out to the right, we'll accelerate, clean up the aircraft, complete our after takeoff checks, and then make a nice wide turn in the valley before we start heading up to the north to get up to Yongai. That's pretty much it. So, auto feather, flaps, and flight controls. And ready to go. Full power coming up on the brakes. The ground roll conventionally is about 5 seconds before you apply backstick. Full power's checked, T's and P's are in the green, rolling. About 5 seconds, backstick pressure. Let's get the nose on the end of the strip, hold. Let it fly off. We don't need the gear. Gear is up. 55 knots there at the moment. Over the trees, lowering the nose to accelerate. Coming up to 20 and 15 for acceleration. Turn out to the right. Here's 85 knots, flap coming up. Through our 95 knots, flap is up and indicating. I'll reduce our power. We'll come back to what we call METO initially, maximum except takeoff, to 550, and we'll come back to conventional climb power 35. Ideally with that set 34, the Caribou will come up 1 usually as you come back on the power. It's not going to do that to me, so I'll reset the 35 and we'll keep the 35 topped up. Okay, now airborne, so after takeoff checks, and our lights are off, auto feather is off, flaps are up and indicating gear is up, lights out, clear right, ahead, above, round to the left and turning left. We'll bring it back up to 95 knots, just keep a little bit up our sleeve during the turn. So this valley off to our right goes out to low ground all the way out to the coast on the east coast of Papua New Guinea. We're turning towards north at the moment. Once we've completed the turn up this valley, we'll be running parallel to the main backbone of the mountain range running up through Papua New Guinea. Okay, happy with that. Now we'll set ourselves up and trim for the 95. We're going to hold to the right of the valley. As we continue our climb, we're going to be turning left into the valley at 11 o'clock. And the strip that we're going to, Yongai, is about 6,500 feet, so we'll continue our climb to get to that point by the time we arrive. Now we'll just settle it down. 95 knots, get it trimmed, and then we can start talking about a few things in the cockpit. We'll just make sure everything is set here first. Okay, so I did promise we'll have a look around the cockpit at different things here. So the wheel on the left hand side for a start, going left to right, it's nose wheel steering. White indicator shows where it's centered. If you pull the wheel backwards, the nose goes to the left. Push it forwards, nose goes to the right. Switch forward of that is for the nose wheel steering. There's no reason to switch it off. As soon as the weight on wheels comes on the ground, that switch is activated. The weight on wheels when you lift off the ground deactivates the nose wheel steering system. On the back end of the control column here, you'll see the W-shaped piece of metal riveted on there. It's a convenient place to put your pens, but that's not what it was for originally. Originally, that's where your ashtray would sit, so somewhere to rest your cigar. Keeping in mind these aircraft came out in the late 50s, but it's kind of cool to have that. Forward to the left, what looks like a large billiard ball, that's your punka louver for fresh air. If you open up that valve, you are literally looking straight out at the ground. It's just got a little scoop on the side of the nose there. You can see out through there. Out of interest, the window here can be opened, and if you're looking for the right seating position in VR, just sit in a position where you can comfortably rest your elbow on there like a Jeep. You're pretty much right. So I look across at the seat on the other side, look here, and then you should be just starting to interfere with the top of the AOA indicator here directly in front at the moment as well. Just keep that airspeed going, top up our power. Okay, but this window can be left wide open while you're flying. It's really good. There's no air conditioning inside the aircraft, but one thing you do have to be wary of, there are so many things that have been sucked out of these windows. I even had a co-pilot once that sitting in the seat had a plastic folder with a little mini calculator on it, all of the paperwork for the task that we were on, and it just disappeared straight out the window. That happens. I even heard one that was funny where the guy's going from Perth across to Adelaide from memory along the bottom of the south coast of Australia, and the map that they were using went out the window and wrapped around the leading edge of the wing back there. The flight engineer was down inside the back end of the aircraft here looking up at the wing, trying to see what the next reporting point would be. Probably myth, probably didn't happen, in case anyone gets upset and I end up in trouble with the Air Force, but makes for a good story anyway. One of the things I did hear about related to the Caribou in Vietnam with this punka louver and with the windows is that some guys felt a lot better if they took their pistol and ended up with that handgun firing out the window as they were getting airborne. They knocked that on the head pretty quickly because the expended rounds were actually taking chips out of the propeller. Not great. Okay, 95 knots, still sticking to the right hand side of the valley. West at the moment, so we're coming perpendicular to the main range, the backbone of Papua New Guinea. That gets up to about 11,500 feet where we're looking at the moment, and we're going to be ducking through there later on. Initially, however, the strip we're going to Yongai, there's a dark patch of bush across the valley from where we are now. Right at the peak, at the top of that dark patch, is Yongai Strip. 973 foot grass, it's quite steep. Probably the trickiest thing about it though is the undershoot. So on short finals there's some significant obstacles in terms of trees and bushes. It's at 6,400, so we've got another 500 to go before we reach the elevation of that strip, which is how things get very deceptive in Papua New Guinea flying. It looks at the moment like we're level with the strip. We're just getting there at the moment, but you can get screwed up big time. This pad that's coming up on the nose now, we want to just clear this pad and set ourselves up for final into Yongai. So I'm going to reduce the power now, coming back to our cruise power just to be level. Again, if I get out to 1900, you'll see the oil pressure gauges light up. I don't. There's 1900, so if I go to 2000, that won't happen. Going to concentrate on the approach here now. Alright, so this pad's where we want to be positioned. We're below 120, landing gear handle down, gear travels, speed below 105, flat 15, it likes to pitch up, 3 greens, speed below 95, and going props max. Start positioning ourselves for the final here. Holding flat 20 and holding basically co-altitude with the strip at the moment. I'd like to be a little bit higher than that. We'll keep pushing across to the extended center line, which is not that track that you see. It's a little bit off that, running up the strip. This strip's a bit nasty in that you get quite a uplift, has an updraft on short final, followed pretty shortly thereafter by a significant downdraft. Okay, speed below 85, going flat 30. And speed below 80 going flat 40. So there's a gap in the trees there. Believe it or not, we can just fit through that gap, but we'll try and rise over the top of it. Again, 973 feet. So let's hold our airspeed here now. She does hold on the back end of the drag curve. We have 3 greens, rich, fine, and 40 flat. There's our updraft. There's our downdraft. Holding. Keeping the power on a little bit just to help with the round out, looking up the strip. And there we are. Don't need reverse. We're going to roll through to the top of the strip. I'll carry that momentum around a little bit. All clear on the right. And hold. Okay, we're going to come up to flat 25 for a short field out of here. Make sure our auto feather switch is on. Trims are good, rich and fine, although at this altitude we'll get significantly more power coming back to auto lean, but we should be 33 inches at auto lean. I'm not convinced at the moment that the mixtures are actually doing what they should be doing in the sim. But if I come up to full power now, you see we hold power there. If I come back to auto lean, we get significantly more, and that makes all the difference. And rolling. Backstick pressure. Attitude, hold, and hold the speed to climb out over the trees, lower the nose, gear up, accelerating, and we'll be to the left up the valley. Going flat 20, flat 15, accelerating. .85 flap up, power's coming back. Remembering with piston engine aircraft, the power changes is where you're likely to end up getting your engine failures. So certainly we want to keep that auto feather switch in until that's sorted. Again, we'll contour around the right hand side of the valley. It gives me exit room to the left. If we had an engine failure, we'd have a drift down height, which we'll talk about shortly. We'll just get these checks completed at the moment. And auto feather is off. 95 knots, 35, 2250. Set. Yeah, so if we lost an engine, we're only going to be able to maintain a particular height, which is a little bit lower than where we are right now, probably about 5,000 feet or so, but I have to go into the books to work that out, based on our weight, of course. I want 95 knots holding. So our escape would be to the left to follow down, and then a right turn that heads out towards the coast following that main valley down. Now with 95 knots at the moment, I'm looking at the ranges. It's quite clear at the moment I'm not going to make it over the ranges. I'm setting a predetermined speed of 90 knots in my mind. If I get down to 90 knots at any point, that's an automatic abort, turn away from the high ground and continue the climb facing the other way down the valley. Very lucky with the weather today. We're just looking at the caribou functionality, not trying to deal with low-hanging scud at the same time. So clear, left, ahead, above, round to the right. around to the left rather, turning left. So gentle angle of bank, and keep the angle of bank low so we keep the climb performance going. I could set METO power as well, but I would like to try and show some of the decision making and operating in the mountains here as well with this limited performance. So what else can we talk about? Yes, when you take 15 flat, like we're going to the strip there, you'll get a pronounced pitch up moment in the caribou. That pitch up due to the center of pressure change on the wing with the 15 flat when that extends, and there's actually a geared interface between the flap and the horizontal stabilizer itself. So the horizontal stabilizer on the whole moves as you deploy the flap, and that's to help counter some of that pitch up movement. Unfortunately, if the horizontal stabilizer was to fail, it will aerodynamically go to a full up position, which will give you a pronounced nose down. So if you were in a high speed descent, like you're trying to lose height quickly, and that system failed, you end up with a very pronounced nose down pitch, and it would take significant force to raise the nose, which would not be fun. Okay, let's come back to our 95, 35, all clear right, ahead, above, round to the left, and we'll turn left again. So looking inside the aircraft again, right on the dashboard in front of us at the moment, we've got the short field indicator. That's only valid for 40 flap, and it has the triangle there for 28,500 pounds, and obviously the diamond for 26,000 pounds. I've found that for the model to perform the way that it should in the sim, where it feels like it's just on the edge of the stall and on the back end of the drag curve, which is how you end up flying it from a stall performance, certainly from what I was taught with the military anyway. You really want to be just at the top end of the slow bracket there, so lower than the diamond but top end of the slow. If you hold that, then you'll end up getting a more realistic performance. To put that into perspective, the caribou, when you're running that short field on final, a 2-knot gust as a tailwind is all you can really tolerate before you need to recover with the power for the rate of descent increase that you're going to see. Airspeed, correcting. And similarly, if you're coming down to the strip at more than 1200 foot per minute rate of descent, then you're going to run out of lift to arrest that rate of descent, and you will end up landing very heavily, and people have done that before. Keep in mind that when you're landing an aircraft conventionally and you're on that VREF speed, you want to raise the nose to round out and develop the flare without the aircraft ballooning up. So you're really just changing the attitude of the aircraft. If you come into a steep slope strip and you try and do the same thing, you're going to change the attitude of the aircraft, but all you're going to do is keep moving forwards and presenting all three wheels to the slope like a fly landing on a wall, but far less graceful. The idea on slope landings, therefore, if it's a very steep slope, you want to be using the power to anticipate the round out. And in high drag aircraft like this, like the Twin Otter, like the Caravan, like anything that's built for STOL, they're very responsive to that coupling, whereby increasing the power will actually increase the pitch at the same time. So if you get your VREF sorted out, you can use your power to lead your round out and cast yourself up the slope of the strip. Okay, I've got two valleys here. One over the far side at first glance might look more inviting because it's shallow, but I would prefer to run up the right hand valley here because it is steeper. In being steeper, if I have any kind of problem at the moment, my escape path is still out to the left and back down the valley, but the vertical nature of the terrain here allows me to use more of the vertical as well, such that I can maintain the airspeed that I require. It gives me more options for maneuvering out of this environment if I have an issue. I'm contouring around the valley here at the moment, or the head of the valley, so that I can cover more ground and get more climb completed before we reach the point we want to cross over the range. Still looking escape path out to the left, and topping up our power. We're max throttle height now, 33 psi. Another thing to consider, if you look at the ridgeline right in front of us, if you see the terrain rising behind the ridgeline, that means you're going to clear that ridgeline. Really worth knowing that when you're in this kind of environment as well. If we look at the second ridgeline over, we come out of this turn and I will roll wings level, and we'll see if we're going to cross that ridgeline effectively or not. So we'll look at the terrain behind. If the terrain behind the ridgeline is rising against that ridgeline in the foreground, we know we're going to make it. So let's come around, hit 95 knots, wings level. A little bit of turbulence in here. Okay, so you can see the terrain rising behind the ridgeline. I'm at 95 knots. I know I'm going to clear that ridgeline. Escape to the left. There's Yongai down by the dark forested bush on the right hand side of the valley. And you can see the valley going down here and turning right all the way out to the coast. Picking up speed, we don't need a lot more height. Before I commit to the top of the tablelands here and happy with the speed, I'm going to reduce the power now to what's very close to a 700 brake horsepower cruise. I'm going to set 30 inches and 2000. As I said before, if we're going to have an engine failure or any kind of anomaly, just checking our instruments now, and you can see the oil temperature gauge just sits right up the top for a long period of time. But if we were going to have any kind of engine failure, I would like to have it here where I have an escape path already, and I'm not committed to trying to get across this plateau on the high ground. So we are approaching 11,500 feet now. That contouring that you have to do in order to get your climb, you can imagine with a little bit of bad weather around as well, very, very easy to become disoriented in terms of your navigation. Now we have GPS, which I haven't even switched on here at the moment, just doing it visually. But in the old days, when you're running around in Papua New Guinea, particularly the pioneers, it would be very, very easy to get disoriented, even in good weather, and end up flying up the wrong valley, finding that you don't have the performance anymore to escape. That's one of the elements of flying the Caribou in this environment that I really enjoy, because it keeps you thinking. You've got limited performance, you have to think ahead of the aircraft. And people joke, it's a slow aircraft. It is a slow aircraft. It's compromised to achieve a very specific task as taking a lot of weight into a very short, very rough strip. But even as a slow aircraft, it's very easy to get behind. You need to keep thinking ahead. The less performance you have, the more challenging it is to be operating in any kind of mountain environment. Now, if we're in New Zealand at the moment, this will be snow-capped, jagged-looking peaks. So it can become a little bit deceptive. Idaho's the same thing. You get up into high-density altitudes in Idaho, and it looks like rolling green hills and grassy paddocks. So it's very easy to underestimate the effect of the density altitude in that environment. Just easing back on the power now. One of the rules with the power is you want to maintain at least 1 inch of manifold pressure for every 100 RPM. So we've got 2000, I can set 20 inches, and we'll continue down with the descent. We're at 130 knots at the moment. I could increase the speed further. I'd rather not if we get into any kind of turbulence. A strip there now off at our left 10, that's Waitapi, I think that's the right pronunciation. Which reminds me as well, if you're looking at any of these strips and you're trying to work out what the slope is, we know the low ground is out to the distance on our left hand side. That means that the slope is likely to be up towards us. But the most telling thing when you're operating to these strips is where the parking area or the turnaround bay is, because that will be a fair indication. You can see that turnaround bay is up this end of the strip, so that's a fair indication that the slope of that strip is up towards us at this end of the strip. Now that's a fairly big strip. I mean, as far as Papua New Guinea is concerned, that's nearly an international runway, but you can still make out information from the strip even at altitude. Where we're going is down the valley over here, heading out towards the west, and you can see just between the throttle and the prop levers there's a village in amongst some roads running up the side of the hill, and a significant road running on the far side of the valley, casting high left to low right on the ridgeline. If you follow that road down to just where the corner of the throttle is there at the moment, say again, the corner of the prop lever, and looking at the corner of the prop lever, there is a village at about that point on the right hand side of the valley. That village is what we need to cross over to be configured to cross the ridgeline and get into Fane Strip, which is right on the left hand side of the valley over the back of this ridgeline where the road is. So the priority at the moment is to descend the aircraft comfortably. We'll lose the energy. We're using more track miles again to contour our way down. Our escape is now shifted from the valley on the left and behind us to the valley on the right. The valley on the right will continue down as far as we can see, then makes a 90-degree left turn and continues low level out to the ocean on the west coast. So there is a good escape route in there as well. Again, don't be fooled, the conditions here today are absolutely perfect. Papua New Guinea and flying in Papua New Guinea, the challenge is really about the weather. The strips are challenging, but the real challenge is the weather. We're looking here in the aircraft, the fire extinguisher bottles in the Caribou. They're unique if you look at them in contrast with the Twin Otter. Very similar setup, the emergency panel's in the same place, but in the Caribou, if we had a fire in the left-hand engine at the moment, we could pull that T-handle after we shut it down and use the fire bottle that is positioned in the left-hand engine nacelle. If it didn't work for whatever reason, we could push the handle back in, rotate it to the left, pull again, and you can see second shot. That ports the fire extinguisher bottle from the right-hand engine across to the left. So we get 2 shots for each engine. Twin Otter doesn't have that. It has a single bottle. Once you've used that bottle on that side, that's it. There's no porting across the top, which they may have done simply to reduce weight with the extra plumbing, and PT6 engine maybe not as vulnerable. There is an issue with the radial engines, or this particular radial engine, and the accessory gearbox in the back of the engine is made of magnesium. There have been occasions in history where the magnesium casing has caught fire. That could be something like a starter motor that fails to disengage or engages during flight for whatever reason. But if you get a significant increase in temperature, some sort of wear in the back end of that accessory gearbox, it creates a fire that's basically impossible to put out. You would recognize that if we had a suspected fire on the left engine. I can make a left turn now, have a look at what the smoke was saying. The flight manual actually goes into all sorts of different smoke signals to work out what's going on with your engine as part of your analysis. But if we saw thick white smoke coming out of there, almost like very heavy steam, then we would know that we have a magnesium engine casing fire. At that point, we need to get the aircraft on the ground very, very quickly. The amount of time that the aircraft has survived in the air with that kind of failure is quite variable. There was one instance where it lasted less than 2 minutes, another where they had a full sort of 15-20 minutes in the States, and on that occasion they managed to perform an emergency landing. They were over water at the time. They performed an emergency landing on a beach, and shortly after they got the aircraft secured on the ground, the wing fell off because the engine and that very, very hot fire is secured to, or very close to, the wing spar itself. So just off the left wingtip there at the moment, you can see the village on the right hand side of the valley. We want to be set up energy wise overhead that village so that we're ready to drop into Fane. Overall today, the flight, if you were to fly as the crow flies, is 44 nautical miles. But I think you can see at the moment, we do about 2 miles a minute. It should be a 22-minute flight. That's simply not the case when you're trying to get in and out of these places and maneuver as required. There are ways in which we could do this faster today if we're setting different power settings, but I think it's interesting and of value to look at maneuvering to get into these locations and the considerations involved. Hopefully you feel the same. One of the things we can do to increase our rate of descent, start sorting out the energy now, is to take the gear down, speed below 120, landing gear handle down. The landing gear, if you hold up to 120 knots, not above, ends up working as an effective air brake. We have 3 greens, lights out. I'll reduce the power further now. Okay, with gear down, crossing over the village now, below 105, flap 15. Travels below 95, flap 20. Below 85, we go flap 30. There's Fane Strip opening up to the left. 70 knots, happy with that. Props are max, rich, fine, 3 greens. And we'll go below 80, flap 40. And I want to hold the energy coming into here. It's quite common to get updrafts. Even though in the morning things are heating up, and we'll get a nice smooth updraft just looking at that slope up to the threshold of the strip. So we need to be wary of that. I really want to hold this critically at the top end of the slow indication on the AOA at the moment. So a little bit of forward stick pressure to get our airspeed back up and controlling our approach angle with the power. So there's a house on the left-hand side just past the threshold. The house had as a circular ring of grass coming out and extending into the strip. So we'll aim to, our aim point rather will be just before that grass comes into the strip, and hopefully our touchdown point should be just after the grass exits the strip. So getting a bit of an updraft here now as well. Coming back to idle. That aileron input control is absolutely realistic for 40 flap in the Caribou. Airspeed's good, aim point, aspect, airspeed, idle, getting a float, back up. Okay, now thinking about the round out and flare. So we're coming into round out now. Hold, develop, there we go. Not going to use reverse because it's actually going to be quite a steep strip, so we use a bit of power to come up, set ourselves up for the takeoff. So almost full power to get up the strip. And all clear to the left, we'll turn across the strip. If we hold the nose up a little bit, we should be able to roll back. The flight engineer would obviously be looking out for us there as well. Contour across. Use a bit of power as brake, because you don't want to hit the brakes, otherwise we'll tip ourselves onto our backside. Okay, come around to the left. Now we'll set ourselves up for the next takeoff and set the aircraft up for the takeoff. So yeah, quite a steep strip, but a fun strip. Alright, we're going to run a 15 flap takeoff from here. We don't need the short field technique because we want to be airborne. We're better off having that compromised at less flap in case we had an engine failure. It'll make it easier for us to depart and follow that escape route off to the left. So we are flap 20, auto feather switch is on, and we'll leave lights. Okay. Running up. Still happy with the trim. And it's full power rolling. 5 seconds rotate. The attitude, airborne, gear up. Accelerating level. Gears up, lights out. Looking for 85 knots below the nose. 85 flat, travels up, clear right. And reducing the power. And it's not a linear reduction here at all. You've got to be really, really gentle. To be fair, it's probably, from memory, pretty similar to the real aircraft. I'm just going to be a little bit more gentle with the proper power levers. Okay, so we gear up, lights out, flap up, indicating auto feather is off, and we're still leaving the lights off. So next event is to continue down the valley. We'll cross over the saddle that you see approaching the 12 o'clock position now. We're still holding to the right of the valley. Our escape path is to the end of the valley, left turn out to the coast. Looking at fuel at the moment, we've got 1,500 pounds, like 3,000 pounds total, which is about 5 hours of flying. Caribou planning figure is 600 pounds per hour, which is pretty cool because you think it's a 28 litre motor on each side. They're burning 600 pounds an hour. 600 pounds an hour is the same as the conventional planning figure that we use for the Twin Otter. Twin Otter will burn a little bit less, but it's interesting, those tiny little PT6 engines will burn almost as much fuel as a 28 litre piston on each side. It does make the fuel planning figures a lot easier. I'll just come back to cruise power now. I'm happy with the height. It does make the fuel planning easier because 600 pounds an hour means if you have a 10-minute interval to the next location, you add a 0, and that's how much fuel you're going to burn. 10 minutes, 100 pounds. If you have 450 pounds of fuel in a tank, that's 45 minutes. Just drop the 0 off. So very, very simple to do the maths. Obviously this aircraft was in Vietnam, 600 pounds an hour. The other aircraft that I like to fly a lot is the Huey, UH-1. It was operated by 9 Squadron in Vietnam. It would also run 600 pounds an hour. So someone was making the aircraft in a way that was very convenient for those that may struggle with their maths a little bit. Good news too that 9 Squadron has been stood up again. It's a very famous squadron, famous for things like the Battle of Long Tan, but I was reading the other day that they've just stood it back up again. It's now going to be operating the MQ-4 drones. It's a little bit different. They've had a very varied history as a squadron. Okay, I'm coming into the saddle here. You see I'm not approaching straight towards the saddle. I'm going to come in. I've got my escape path still off to the left. I'm going to come a little bit closer, and then I will approach to cross the saddle at 45 degrees. Now, there's a couple of reasons for doing that. If it was military and fast jet, you would never approach straight across the ridge line either as a ridge line crossing. You come in at an angle, you pull up, you have a look over the other side, you make sure that it's clear and no one's shooting at you. If they do, you can break away and escape. If they're not, you can roll in and continue. For us, there might be bad weather on the other side. We can see that it's all clear. That's great. But at the same time, I know that I've still got an escape path here until I'm convinced, like I am now, that if I had an engine failure, I can escape to the other side of the ridgeline, and then I'll commit. Now, in some schools, like in New Zealand, in the documentation that they have in mountain flying, they say once you cross the ridgeline, depart the ridgeline at 90 degrees. I don't entirely agree with that. I get it that they're looking at getting out of the turbulence as soon as possible, but I prefer to come around off a 45 degree. You're going to end up making that same ground at about 70-75% of the same rate. But now I have clear visibility and I know what's under my nose. Right now I can't see, but I know what's out to the left. So if I need to egress or make an adjustment, I can turn to my left and I've already cleared below the nose. Feels very uncomfortable doing that otherwise. Just over to the bottom right of the windscreen at the moment, you can see Tapini. I need to lose some height, some energy. I'm going to make a wide left-hand orbit here to come back down the valley. If you see some texture popping and terrain coming in as well, I was having some issues with VR. So I had to drop a lot of the settings down, otherwise it was going to be a slideshow. And by a slideshow, I mean you're getting one image every 3 seconds or so. Okay, reducing the power. On this occasion as well, we'll see, raise the nose a little bit, get our speed below 120. Speed is below 120, landing gear handle down. Gear traveling, clunk, and 1, 2, 3 greens. Those noises, by the way, the timing, the sounds of the gear coming down and so on, absolutely bang on for the Caribou. That's not improvised from anywhere, that's exactly what it sounds like. And I've forgotten, I haven't flown the Caribou since the mid-90s, so it is so good to come and jump in and look out and see that view of the radial out in that wing. One of my favorite aircraft ever was the B-25. Never got to fly it, but I always felt that flying the Caribou was certainly as close as I was ever going to get. So now we got the gear down, we can hold 120, we've got 1,000 foot per minute, we got max 120, and we'll just use the track miles to drop our height down. For those that haven't had the joy of flying in mountainous terrain before, particularly places like Papua New Guinea, you're going to use a lot of ground features getting to these different strips. So if I look over to the right hand side of the valley at the moment, in the distance up where Tapini is, there's a cleared area up on the hill that extends from about 2/3 of the way up the ridgeline down to about 1/3 of the way up from the bottom. Where the bush starts at the bottom of that clearing, that's the line I want to come into Tapini, and by the time I get to the actual ridge line that we're seeing on the 12 o'clock there now, at the bottom of that line where the vegetation is lacking, then I want to be in the correct energy state, gear down, flaps ready to turn final and get into Tapini. These strips are one-way strips for the most part, and you don't get a second chance. If you screw it up and you end up in there with too much energy, you're going to have problems, as in it's not going to end well. You'll overrun the strip and you've got no way to turn off and go anywhere else. Tapini is a great place to stop at the end of today's flight because it's famous in RAF circles, I suppose. It's one of the strips that most commonly go into on STOL trainers. STOL training come up with usually a couple of aircraft, so you've got one to provide support as well, so mutual support between the two. Bring a couple of crews up and just run from strip to strip to strip, practicing all of these different techniques, meeting a lot of the locals, like to maintain a good bond with Papua New Guinea. And that's harder to do now. The C-27J is a replacement for the Caribou, can't get in there and do the same thing. Okay, I need to start thinking about my energy state now. So there's the bottom of the clearing I was talking about, and I want to be certainly reduced energy by the time I get there and appropriate for that base turn. So speed below 105, flap 15, speed below 95, flap 20, speed below 85, flap 30, this is a little bit quick, and props coming max, speed below 80, yeah, I'll go flap 40, and I'll hold 60 knots, a little bit of power now. We'll start down the hill. So there's Tapini. Usually 40 flap is something you don't really want to take on finals because she is tricky. You just need to have a little bit more anticipation. I'd like to get that energy sorted out. It feels a little slippery. The numbers on the whole are pretty good with the Caribou. There's a few anomalies, things that we've talked about in terms of oil temperature gauges and so on, but the numbers themselves are pretty good. Just the attitude is way off for 40 flap, and it feels like it doesn't have anywhere near the drag that it should have. Okay, I'm going to turn on to final now, being careful to keep the nose low to preserve the airspeed. And it's starting to shape up all right. So we'll go across the bush into the strip here. 60, I don't need it, but I'd like to come back into the top of the slow sector on the AOA. There we go. Now we'll hold that. Bit of an updraft. Clear of the trees. And the VREF figures are actually planned for idle. And into the flare, hold. Now we'll gently lower the nose before we lose the elevator authority this time. The only thing we do on the runway conventionally is to raise the flap, because raising the flap will give you more braking force, increasing the weight on the wheels. One of the curious things with the Caribou is if you do get it stuck and you're operating in places where you can, and I have managed to get it stuck in the past, keeping the gust lock off and these sorts of strips at the moment allows you to use plenty of power and get through an area if you do start to bog. The other thing that you can do is throw down full flap, because you're deflecting some of that prop thrust and making the aircraft a little bit lighter on the wheels. Sometimes that's the difference between getting stuck and spending hours trying to dig it out, or actually getting through it with any luck. I was talking about the fuel burn figures there as well before, so 600 pounds an hour for both engines running. But an interesting thing with this aircraft is that if you lose one engine, the remaining engine set at the power to keep you aloft will burn as much as 1,000 pounds per hour, which does make your fuel planning figures really interesting. And when we flew across to New Zealand in the mid-90s to go to exercise short haul, the planning for that was Lord Howe Island on the way out of Brisbane for lunch, and then overnight at Norfolk Island, which is where a lot of the guys like to buy the Lego for their kids because it was duty free at the time, I seem to remember. Out of Norfolk Island into Whenuapai, or Whenuapai as one of the guys on the crew thought it was pronounced, which is kind of cool. I remember taking the Caribous over there on that trip. It was huge from my point of view, because we did a flight from the base we were at in Rotorua working with the Kiwis, and went down to Queenstown, had a lunch in Queenstown, and flew back up to Rotorua. That was my Seacat tactical captain upgrade for the Caribou for the left-hand seat, and the weather turned to absolute crap on the way home. Nearly all the airfields were closed. We were running 2 aircraft in a combat trail over Cook Strait, and by the time we landed up in Rotorua again at the end of the day, you couldn't see anything. Conventional red lighting inside the cockpit, everything bouncing around, turbulence, horizontal rain. The guys actually came out in the rain to watch us land because they had their concerns. I think they were in for a show. But we got it back down on the ground and went off to the bear tent. Yes, the bear tent, love the Kiwi Defence Force, and debriefed the mission from there. I ended up being passed on that ride simply because Tony Bennett, it was, the XO at the time, felt that I got him back alive and that was worth a pass. So that was cool, but really fond memories. So when the Caribou was announced to come out into Microsoft Flight Sim in association with the New Zealand pack, with my family still living in Queenstown in New Zealand, that's hugely significant, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to get in and do the Caribou a bit of service in terms of being able to review it for people Just running a switch check before we shut down. Alrighty. So that's it, guys. I haven't talked about everything. I've got way too much to talk about, but I really hope that you enjoyed it, you got something out of it. I also really hope that people grasp the Caribou and understand just what an incredible machine it actually is. Big place in my heart for it, that's for sure. Alright, thanks guys. Catch you later. Bye.